Welcome to this video, which is probably going to be split into several parts, to be honest, because I started this and then I got so far through the script writing and thought actually this is going to be a long video and I don't like particularly long videos, so I am going to split it into several parts. I just don't know at this point in time how many parts this video is going to be split into. Hey ho. But this video is all about this keyboard that's sitting in front of me. And for those that don't know what it is, and there will be headshots in a minute, this is the JX-8P. This is a keyboard delivered by Roland in 1985, and it effectively remained in production until 1989. So it had a fairly good production run of four years, and in fact I think it went out production mid to late 1989. And I put this keyboard into context that this keyboard was still in production when the new flagship D-50 came out in 1987, and effectively went head to head with the D-50 for a few years until Roland decided to stop production. Now, whether that was because the demand had dropped off by that point, or whether Roland were trying to push people into the digital arena, I can't tell you. I suspect it was something to do with the latter. But this keyboard stood its own ground. It was the second from last flagship analog synth that Roland actually delivered in this period of time. I was corrected on Instagram the other day because I completely forgot there was a synthesizer after this, which was the JX-10P, which was not much of an upgrade, I have to be honest. I mean, it was an upgrade, but it wasn't a massive leap from this to that. So this keyboard arrived in 1985, and I have to at this point put a thank you out to Richard H from the South Coast Synth Hut, or Synth Cave as he calls it, for lending me this example so I could actually show it on the channel. So why was this keyboard so coveted that Roland recently decided to put it into here? And I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, I know the raison d'etre behind this was to model old synthesizers, and this is an old synthesizer, so they've modeled it. It's over here, and I kind of get that, and it's not far off. Now, I haven't got the sound plumbed into the camera. You're hearing the sound from the speakers, but that's generated by this keyboard. And if I go over to here and go, I've got to turn down a bit. I'm not sure that's going to come over on camera, but it's not an exact copy of the bass preset, but the bass choir pad on this is not far off. You can hear the tonal qualities between the two of these machines is pretty close, and I could repeat that on certain other sounds on here like Fat Fifth, etc., that are very, very close between these two machines. So, but why did Roland choose to take the 8P and not the 10 or the 3P? Well, I suppose the 3P is because they've already done that in the boutiques. That's probably one of the reasons why the 3P didn't move across. But other than that, I can't tell you the difference. But why did this machine keep its own with the D-50 for a couple of years? And the one thing you'll notice about this keyboard is if you look at it, if you're looking at it head on, you'll notice that there's virtually no knobs or faders in this interface. And later in the video, the camera will be up here and you'll be able to actually see the keyboard itself. But if you're looking at it at the moment, you can see that there are very few, I mean, there's a few faders here, but pretty much this is the control surface of the keyboard, and there's no knobs really or faders in that control surface area. You have, and you'll see this in a minute, you have a 15 or 16 character, what I used to call a calculator screen, and you'll see why in a minute, but there's no knobs or faders. So you're sort of sitting there looking at this saying, is it an analog or is it a digital synth? It is an analog synth. It really is an analog synth. It's probably more of a digital hybrid analog in terms of the way the sound is generated, and we'll come on to that later on. But this is an analog synth, whereas the D-50 was a digital synth. Everything to do with the D-50 was digital. It moved over to something called linear arithmetic synthesis, which was shortened on all those synths to LA synthesis, and has been used by Roland pretty much ever since, or a derivative thereof. And that's what made the swap to the D series and synthesizers thereon more appealing to users, was the difference in nature between the behavior of an analog synth and the behavior of a fully digital synth. But this is not here to talk about digital synths or digital versus analog. This is an analog synth. That's how the JX-8P rolls. This is the part in the video where I get to do the channel self-promotion. So, I'm going to whiz through this bit. Away you go. But we must observe parish notices. If you like videos about this sort of stuff, and anything else you see around me, hit the subscribe icon. Save yourself some time, hit the bell icon at the same time. You'll be notified when videos like this hit the channel. If you enjoyed the contents of this video, give it a thumbs up. Really helps the video on YouTube, other people find this content. And please leave comments down below. Your comments are sometimes great insights into further aspects of the stuff that's in the video. They give me ideas for future videos, and I do read them and I do reply to each one. So thank you very much. Somewhere down there will be the TMTG community. Help this channel keep rocking and rolling. Support the channel for less than the price of a cup of coffee every month. And finally, down there, Instagram, Facebook, feeds, tags, whatever you want to call them, that's where the normal channel notices are. But now, back to this particular video. So let's go over the basic stats of this analog synthesizer. It was the middle synth of three particular synthesizers. Before this was a synthesizer called the JX-3P, and after this was a synthesizer called the JX-10. The 3P had what I would call a much busier interface than what you see on this particular synthesizer, and it was noticeable that it had much more bolder colours on the 3P. Did pretty much the same thing, little less powerful. The 10P, sorry, the JX-10, not the 10P, again, pretty much similar layout, but Roland dropped this membrane style interface for an interface that was more button based, so very much not quite the same as the D-synth, but I suppose buttons that were more akin to something like a drum machine, sort of fairly decent sized centimetre buttons. That's the kind of where they went from this membrane interface to the 10P, and I have to be honest, I'd probably do prefer that, but we'll come on to that later. The other thing they introduced was, it was very noticeable, there was a keypad on this side for entering numeric values, and over here what they did was they put in what we now see on a lot of their synthesizers as the data wheel, so a big wheel that you could jog one way or the other to enter values into the machine quickly. But they were the predominant differences. Obviously the 10P was slightly more powerful than the 8P, and the 8P was slightly more powerful than the 3P, but they all used a fairly similar construct in terms of how the sound was constructed. The basic stats around this 8P are, it's 61 keys from here to here. When you see this in a minute from the sort of heli view, you'll notice that there is a display. I can only describe it as what I used to call a calculator style display, single line, I can't make my mind up whether it's 15 or 16 characters long at the moment, but I think it's 16 characters. I've written in my notes "no expense spared," and you'll see that in a sec. It is actually 6-note polyphony. What does that mean? You can play 6 keys before the last one cuts out, and it does do a replace. So if you play the 7th key, will replace the first key that you entered. So that's how the synthesis works. It is velocity sensitive. It does have aftertouch on it. It actually has 64 preset patches on it, with an additional 32 additional user patches which you can program up. And in order to program this, you really did need the PG-800 programmer, and I'll do some stuff on programming this in a later video. You also had a memory cartridge which was up here. Again, you'll see that when the helicon comes up. And the key point to this is it's built around 2 DCOs. And for those that don't know, a DCO is a digital controlled oscillator, and that's per voice. So every voice you had on here, you effectively had 2 DCOs supplying the tonal quality. The DCOs is a nod to where Roland was obviously going at this point. The D-50 was probably already under construction when this keyboard hit the market, and they would have taken the aspects of digital out of this keyboard as the basis going forward. And what do I mean by digital? Well, wave shaping of the sound generation in this is digital. The is analog. The oscillators, what controls the timing of the oscillators, is actually a digital signal. It uses a digital signal to lock it to specific frequencies. So I wrote on my notes in English, what does that mean? With a non-digital oscillator, so a true analog synthesizer, you will have pieces of analog circuitry inside the machine that are designed to kick out certain voltages at certain levels, and to kick out a timing signature based on some analog circuitry that generates the timing of the keyboard itself. The problem with analog circuitry is that it is incredibly susceptible to temperature. And if you've ever watched videos on things like the Roland Jupiter-8 and certain other videos, but the one that springs to mind is the Jupiter-8, you could put the synthesizer in you could go gigging with it, you could put it on the stage, do a sound check on it when the venue was quite cold, if you think about it. 2 or 3 hours later, when there was lots of sweaty bodies in that venue, the temperature of the venue will start to rise. And the synthesizer itself was quite susceptible to the rises in temperature. And there are many stories of groups coming to record with these analog synthesizers, and what they would do is go and switch the synthesizer on and let it warm up for 2 hours, then get a tech in to tune it, so that they knew that at a certain temperature it was then back in tune. But these things would kick out of tune quite quickly, and that was because the things that supplied information to the oscillators to generate the sound were susceptible to heat, humidity, and, to be quite honest, which day of the week it was. So it was a little bit hit and miss. I know everybody loves the old Jupiter-8, but believe me, people I've talked to who are older than me tell me that sometimes those analog synthesizers were a nightmare. And they also had the problem with the analog synthesizers that if you had a patch set up on an analog synthesizer, on the true ones, if you didn't have every parameter written down, you might struggle to get that patch back again. So that's kind of where it was. Whereas with a digital analog synthesizer, even though the wave shaping is all analog, so in terms of what happens to the wave, it comes out, it's analog, it's generated analog using analog circuitry. The actual timing of how that wave is generated and the trigger for when it's generated is all done by a digital chip, which means that they are not susceptible to temperature, to humidity, to the day of the week. And it therefore made it easier to lock and reproduce the sound time and time again, which is why manufacturers, I think, moved down that route, because I think, you know, users were demanding stability. You know, they were, you know, gone were the days of haphazard sound on stage. You know, the public were demanding the sound, the record sound, and users, in order to get the record sound, demanded stability. But of course, people turn around and say, you know, the sort of variability of an analog synth is how it gets its warmth. All I can say to those sort of people is, if you ever use one of these things on tour, you might change your mind. And I'm going to leave it at that, because the tonal qualities change quite dramatically between a cold analog synth and a warm analog synth, and various stages in between. But this video is not about discussing analog versus digital. It's all about this machine. I'm going to change the camera setup now so you can actually see the synthesizer itself, and then we'll go through some of the bits and bobs on this synthesizer, which is probably what you tuned in for anyway. Okay, I set the camera up so it captures most of the keyboard information. There's a little bit more over here, and if I swing the camera around a bit, you can see the last of it over here, but we're not going to concentrate on these bits on this video. We're just really going to concentrate on this sort of area in the center. So go back, there you go. So it's nicely centered. Now, the things I was saying about this in the intro here, and I haven't given this a clean, it does need a good clean. I probably will sit down and clean this later on, as I bash it with my knees as I'm getting myself centered on the keyboard. So the key things you'll notice about this is the fact that that is the screen, and as you can see, it is what I call a calculator screen. This is what, you know, my first calculator when I was very young, which was probably the late 70s, would have had a screen that was very similar to this. So here we are 10 years or so after that, and Roland was still putting these screens in their synthesizers. So that's it, and it literally just tells you very simple information. In this case, it's telling me that I'm on patch 8, which is that one there. If you were to look at this keyboard, you know, it has a degree of legend and folk lore around this keyboard, but when you actually look at this membrane keyboard, I'm not going to lie to you, it's horrible. You know, it really sort of, Roland have taken something away from the DX7, because this is kind of the style of the DX7 and a number of machines that followed it. Was this sort of membrane keyboards, and I'm not a fan of membrane keyboards at all. I really don't like membrane keyboards. This has had a little bit of a tough life. It's had a few knocks and scrapes on the membrane here, but it's, you know, it's in terms of the way these keyboards were put together and how the switches underneath them work, never a great fan. And if you had somebody who was a bit sort of overly generous in pressing buttons, then, you know, typically it could actually damage the membrane, and then it was a real nightmare to try and repair. In fact, I don't think you could repair it as it currently stands. That's the reason why there's a big gouge over here, which unfortunately I keep catching. But that said, this is kind of the sort of the main operation of the keyboard, is between here and here, between these 2 points. It is different to, as I said, to the 3P. The 3P had proper buttons. The 10 also went back to proper buttons. So this was the only keyboard that had this membrane style in the range. And yet this is the one that's coveted. So is it because of the membrane keyboard? I doubt it somehow. But one of the other things you'll notice about this interface, being from here to here, is actually relatively sparse. There's not a lot of switches here for you to be able to actually press and get in and out of various different modes, etc. And that kind of gives you the sort of idea of how simple this keyboard was and why you needed the external programmer to be able to use it. The patches, you know, relatively simple. The strings are quite nice. There's low strings. Are fairly resonant. As I say, I played the pad earlier on. You know, that's quite a nice choir sound. I quite like this one, which I've the keys aren't as responsive, but what do you expect from a keyboard that's now getting on for 40 years old? Quite like this. It's got a sort of very brassy type sound to it, and there's a pad. This is a pad. And I know that was used on a very famous song, and I can't think what this sound was. But I've heard that sound on a pop record from around this era, and it's going to drive me potty now because I can't think what the pop sound was. But it's fully functional. It makes a good sound. There is a couple of problems with the sound circuitry, but that seems to have not reared its head today. It was playing up yesterday. Anyway, that's the interface. That really is what you've got to play with on this particular keyboard. Let's get into key modes. So what are key modes? Well, key modes are driven by this panel over here. And there are 3 buttons there. One says poly, one says unison, one says solo. So you'd be right to assume that this keyboard has 3 modes of operation. Actually, that's wrong. It has 6 modes of operation because each one of these buttons does 2 things. So let's start with poly mode because that's probably an easy one to explain. If I press poly once, like it is at the moment, effectively I get 6 voices played. That means I can press 6 keys at once. And when I press the 7th key, the first key drops off. Probably not a great thing. Let's go back into a string sound. Okay, so it's the last key that was pressed takes precedent. So that's poly mode, a 6-note polyphonic synthesizer. Each key takes one of those 6 voices, and that's fairly simple to understand. Jobs are good. The next mode on here is something called extended poly, I suppose, and you get to it by just holding the key down. So the light is flashing. I'm hoping that's coming up on camera. And what that does is it holds the notes for their natural resonance. So if you were to play something, each note will be held to its natural decay. To be honest and say, I have been playing with that for about an hour before I did this video, and I was playing with it the other day, and I cannot hear very much difference between flashy mode, apart from the fact I've got something over here that is vibrating on those low notes. I can't hear very much between that sort of extended harmonic mode or the normal mode. I have played around with a number of different voices on this thing, and I can't for the life of me hear much difference between the two. So as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of a bit of a waste. Okay, we then move on to unison. Now unison is kind of an interesting mode, and it gives you some quite interesting effects. But effectively what unison mode does is it gives you 2 voices per key press. So the polyphony drops from 6 to 3. So that's the first thing you notice, that it goes from 6 to 3. But you get 2 of everything on 2 of the same thing. So you can't layer. This is not a layering function as you would be used to in modern synths, where you can layer 2 sounds on top of each other. Effectively you're layering the same sound over itself. Go back to poly. Not sure we're getting a good resonance off that. Let's try this again on go back to poly on that. Can you hear the sort of double toning that's going on? That's what unison mode does. If I were then to go and press unison again, so the light is now flashing, this is the second unison mode. And this is actually really quite funky, because what it does is it plays the same, so you get the same tone again played, but an octave below. So if I press this C here, I'm playing that note and that note at the same time. So if I make a C chord, whichever way you want to make it, let's do it that way. Effectively I'm playing 6 keys, but I'm playing the same 3 notes, just an octave apart. Now that can get quite interesting, I think, if you sort of start thinking about playing some sort of bass notes here. But if you go down an octave, you can get some quite good notes for live production or recording there, where you are very simple, playing a very simple bass line. Up to 3 notes can be played. So that's what unison mode is all about. And then we go down to solo mode, and these, as I say, each one of these is a firm press, so the tack switches are getting old. And solo mode is effectively mono mode. Okay, so one voice is triggered. You can only play 1 key at a time, so it's single, traditional mono synth mode, which is, you know, it's quite good for leads and stuff like that. So if we go, but then we come up with the next mode, which is this with the flashing light, and this is solo on steroids mode. So what this means is you're still playing 1 note at a time in this mode, but you're playing 6 of each. I'm hoping that registered. So effectively what it's doing is it's playing 6 of the same note every time you hit a key. But it doesn't like it cuts out quite a lot. I've noticed that. Now whether that's due to the age of the machine or and things not contacting properly, but you can get some very interesting effects if you switch the portmanteau on. I'm not not going to play with the portmanteau on this particular video, but it's it does say you know, portmanteau is very good, and unison mode it says about portmanteau as well. Whatever, I mean, but that's the modes that this thing operates in. So it's 6 modes, although it looks like 3: the poly, the unison, and solo. So when you boot this machine up, effectively it jumps into voice 1, position 1, and you know that this is a preset because it uses a P, but that's how it signifies a preset. And as I said, this machine comes with 64 presets. However, that is not obvious if you look at the keypad, at the interface here. You can see 1 to 32 clearly laid out, but where's 33 to 64? That's not on here at all. However, if you press the preset button like that, piano 1 becomes piano 4 in position 1. The interesting thing about this is I've looked through the user manual I can find online, and I can't find anywhere where the actual second set of presets are listed anywhere. They're not listed anywhere on here. So, you know, unlike other synthesizers of the day that had dual functions on it, where they either printed the second tone underneath, or they printed it in a menu to the side here somewhere, this doesn't. You know, so, you know, piano 1 goes to piano 4, 5, voices goes to a choir, which is what I was demoing earlier on. So they are 64 on here. These buttons double up for sounds. So that's how you get to it, but you would have to go through and write all those down, because as I said, in the manual itself I can't find reference to these. I can find reference to lots of other things in the manual, although it is quite shallow, I have to be honest, but it doesn't reference the other 32 sounds underneath the 32 you can see. The other thing about these presets is they are in the ROM chip. That's what you get. You can't overwrite them. So there are 64 solid tones on this thing. Then you have this internal bank here, and you know, as I said, the machine's getting old, so you quite often have to press these things a couple of times before you actually get somewhere. And as you can see, I suspect that somebody has had the battery or replaced the battery at some point, and anything that was in the internal memory has now gone. It is completely dead. There is nothing in there whatsoever. So I can't demo any tones that were in this area. Probably not a bad thing given my keyboard playing. And then the last one you have is this cartridge button. And I think it's an M16C cartridge this machine would take, which would give you another 32 voices. So in total you could take this thing on the road with 128 voices loaded if you had a cartridge and you had all the internals programmed up. That's how this machine was set up in the good old days. Now, if you were to set up user voices on this, and what's really interesting about this is this controller, which is here with the relevant cable on it. And the other thing to note is this cable is not a DIN cable. It's not a standard DIN cable, so you can't use MIDI cables to connect the controller to the keyboard, and there is a dedicated slot on the back of this thing. Sorry, I had to stop the video then because the camera decided it was going to couldn't get an autofocus lock on the keyboard for some reason. But there is a dedicated, on the back of this machine, there is a dedicated different port to actually plug that PG programmer in. And what I like about this is, I kind of like this about some of the other synths, which is if you look at the keyboard this way, and I'll just move the camera over so you can see that. Let me just do that, like so. You've got this area over here, which this thing fits on quite nicely. Whether that was by design or not, I'm not sure, but it actually does mag lock onto here. I don't know if you can hear that. There's magnets in this that actually lock that to that area of the keyboard. So that says to me that was done by design. And I will do another video about programming sounds. But when you program sounds up using the PG-800 programmer, effectively it was this internal memory space that you will be putting those sounds into. Now I will see if I can get hold of the original internal sounds, because this would have shipped with 32 sounds in it, I'm pretty sure of that, and see if we can get them loaded up onto this keyboard for one of the future videos I do on this. As I say, this is loaned to me, so I will need to just make sure I'm okay to load up those additional sounds, but I can't see any reason why I wouldn't be, given there's nothing in there at the moment. So there you go. That is sort of the basics of the JX-8P. It is, I can see why it is coveted by individuals. I can see some of the, I mean, I do like this, which is slightly off camera, but there you go. Anyway, that's the JX-8P first video.